Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Once again, I have this privilege that EWTN gives me to join with you to hear a story of how the Holy Spirit opens someone's heart and mind to the beauty of the church. And every journey is a little bit different. And I do pray that our guest tonight, Christopher Zehnder, former Missouri Synod Lutheran, that his story will be an encouragement to you. Christopher, welcome to The Journey Home. It's good to have you in a program. We were talking a little bit before the program. We've got some similar friends, but it's good to have you in a program. And
thank you for having me.
And I also want to thank you for the work you do with the textbooks.
Catholic textbook project.
Textbooks. I know that my wife Marilyn and I were very familiar with your work back when we were in homeschooling, and so thank you for the work that you do for that. But what I usually do is get out of the way as soon as I can and invite you to start us on the journey, if you would.
I will, yeah. In thinking, especially before this program, back on my conversion, I dredged up a lot of memories which I hadn't thought about for a long time. I became Catholic when I was 19, so that's a few years ago. I reflected on just how God uses not mere supernatural means. I mean, everything when God acts is through grace, which is supernatural, but how he uses natural things. You know, grace builds upon nature. And I was thinking about that, just how, in my childhood in particular, how he used both what was good in my family life and what was deficient, not so much in my family. I thought there were deficiencies in my family life, but in the deficiencies of the place I lived. Sometimes I've reflected, if I hadn't grown up in Southern California, if I had grown up in Michigan, like my rest of, my family, where my family's from, would I have become Catholic? And I sometimes think maybe I wouldn't have. That Southern California is just weird enough to get me to consider becoming Catholic. So maybe I'll just talk about what was the positives of my family life. I had an intact family. My parents were married for over 50 years, not when I came around, but later. But I intact, stable family. My mother was a stay-at-home mother. We grew up in a suburb of Los Angeles. This is not one of the suburb's not one of the positive things, but a suburb of Los Angeles. We lived a comfortable life. My father made fairly good money for those days, and it was not a very interesting house, but it was a comfortable house. I was raised Missouri Synod Lutheran, and it gave me a heritage. It gave me a legacy to think back on. And that part of that legacy was, I knew that my family's background. I knew where my family came from. When we would visit Michigan, we'd sometimes go to Frankenmuth, Michigan, or Frankenmuth, I guess a lot of people say, where my family settled in 1846. They came over from the area around Nuremberg, Germany, and as German Lutheran missionaries to the Chippewa, among others. Yeah, that was Frankenmuth. That was its origins. It was a missionary settlement. Wilhelm Löher was the name of the pastor in Neuendettelsau in Germany, who was the genius behind it. So he got this settlement going, and they came to preach the gospel to the Chippewa. Well, then the U.S. government moved the Chippewa west, and they stayed. The Germans who settled there, they stayed and farmed. It's kind of an interesting settlement, sort of a little bit of a side, but it was an interesting settlement because it was a German-speaking settlement. So they were teaching the Chippewa, I think, how to speak German. And part of the I guess the deal of the whole thing was that they were to maintain the German traditions from that area of Germany, Mittelfranken or Middle Franconia, where they came from, and, including the dress. And there's even an account where the Missionary Society in Germany heard rumors that they were wearing wide-brim hats, and that was just not the tradition. So they had to assure them, no, we are still thoroughly German and thoroughly Lutheran. And
did they catch it on the internet back then?
I don't know how they did it.
How they knew back in Germany back then.
So it was, that was my family background, and I felt a deep sense of pride in that. It's that my family had done that. They didn't come over to the New World to make it rich. They came over to the New World, at least initially, to preach the gospel to the Indians. And we grew up, as I said, in the Lutheran Church, which was a very stable kind of influence. And years later, after I became Catholic, I met a priest, actually, in Vancouver, British Columbia, who had been raised in a different synod. For those who don't know the Lutheran Church, it's divided up into synods in the United States, based upon often whether one is a Swedish Lutheran, a Norwegian Lutheran, a German Lutheran, or based upon the fact that some German Lutherans disagree with other German Lutherans over something. Right. And so he said to me, you were raised in the Missouri Synod? He said, that's the real thing. And it was a real thing. And I reflect back. He said this too. He says it was an excellent preparation for becoming Catholic. And I reflect back on that now, and I think it's really true. Growing up in Missouri Synod was very important because they're dogmatic and they're liturgical. And both those things were instilled in me, even though at a certain point, as I'll tell you, I rebelled against all that. But that was instilled in me as a child. We sang hymns, that were sometimes based upon Gregorian chant or were old German hymns. All that sort of thing appealed to me. So that was all the positives. And I had a good family. I was the youngest. My sister is 13 years older than I am. My brother's 9 years older than I am, so it was quite a spread. But, it was a good, stable family. So, it was rather idyllic in some ways.
Were you a child of faith? Brought up in the Lutheran faith yourself, a young man of faith?
Well, that's a good question. I'll say this, I will address that in just a minute. My father, I think, was, when I reflect back on my conversion, I see there were mentors that I had. And one of those mentors, in a kind of distant way, was my father. And he was a mentor not so much, he wasn't around much when I was growing up because for some reason his work, he would fly from Los Angeles to New York City every Monday and come back on Friday. So for much of my childhood, I didn't see much of him. Wow. And then when he worked in Los Angeles, he was on the highways all the time, so he didn't come back until late. So I wasn't very close to my father growing up. But his example of fidelity to his belief, to his Christian faith, was indispensable. I think. I think my brother and sister would say the same thing. They're not Catholic, but I think their faith, they would say, was rooted in my father's example. So he would go to church on Sunday whether he felt well or not. There was no, I don't feel like I'm going to go to church on this Sunday, like you sometimes get in Protestant circles. It was he was faithful to that, and you could tell he made no bones about the fact that he prayed and asked God's help. So that was a very important influence. As for myself, for some reason, I just didn't take much interest in religion for many years when I was very young. I'll have to warn you, I was kind of a strange child, people would say. But so I tended to have certain ideas about things from a very young age that would either turn me on to something or turn me off to it. And for some reason, I was turned off to Lutheran worship and the Lutheran Church. I remember, concerning my father, he knew I liked history. Even as a young child, I liked reading history. So he would take out the hymn and say, "Look when this was written," and this didn't move me at all. I didn't care. So it wasn't. I wouldn't say my father's influence was immediate in terms of my faith. What it was is it gave me a foundation upon which to build. So how I actually began to be interested in religion is kind of strange. I mean, it's not particularly strange. My brother, I would say, my brother Kurt was my second great mentor, you might say. When I was growing up, in some ways took the place of my father. He did a lot of things with me. He would take me fishing. He would, he was a friend to me in many ways. We used to get in our fights. We had our disagreements, like any brothers do. But he was. I think he saw that my father wasn't around much, and so he took it upon himself to do a lot of the things, at least our society would say fathers do, right? Well, he was also not really serious about religion for a long time. But then he used to tell the story. There was a girl that he was interested in, and she went to this place called Calvary Church, not Calvary Chapel, Calvary Church in Walnut, California, another LA suburb. Yeah. And so he started going to church there because she was going there. Well, he underwent a religious conversion when he was there. And I guess it was what he fell into, as we might call the Jesus movement, if you remember that, the Jesus freaks, right?
Yep.
And he became really on fire with this newfound faith. And that, as a young child, I must have been, I would say, well, he graduated high school when I was 9. So 10 or 11, I began to see this newfound faith he had, and I met his friends, and I began to think there's something really genuine here. Because what it was is their religion, their faith was influencing the whole of their lives. You could tell it was just everything, it permeated everything they did, everything they thought, everything they said. And I guess maybe that was what I didn't see in the Lutheran Church. They used to joke around evangelical circles. They used to call Lutheran Church the frozen chosen, you know. And because I
think that moniker fit a few major denominations,
right.
you know, us Presbyterians too.
I don't think it was entirely fair with the Missouri Synod. I know one man in particular was the organist at the Lutheran Church where I went to school for the parochial school, and he and his wife at one point decided to become Bible translators, and they took their little children over to Liberia. So I think sometimes they just didn't, you know, Germans don't show things in the same way other people do. But in any case, I guess I felt that there was the church on Sunday thing with the Lutherans, and then there was the rest of the week. Whereas with the Jesus movement people, it was all week long, every hour of the day, right? And that's, as a child, I mean, this is kind of weird, as a child, that really moved me.
And I would say, being a little bit a part of that Jesus movement, because I had my own adult awakening, just like they did in 1973, in the midst of that time, that there was an authenticity of it. So there was grace there, but it wasn't guided very well during the time. So, I mean, it was enthusiastic, it was life-changing, but now what? As you said, it fed all their life, but there wasn't much guidance there.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I remember there was one particular instance, my brother had decided at a certain point he was going to become a Lutheran minister. So he was influenced by the charismatic renewal, but he was still a Missouri Synod Lutheran, so he was going to go to Concordia University in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And his friends had gathered for this going away thing, and they were I remember in our living room praying and singing, and I, as a kid, I was just watching this, and I thought, I want to be a part of a group like this. I don't want to go to a Lutheran church. They don't do things like this. I wanted something really authentic, and that was a really strong influence on me. And as I'll point a little bit, it began really. I think it was the catalyst for my journey towards the Catholic faith. But to back up just a little bit,
just to remind the audience, Christopher Zehnder is our guest. So go ahead.
Back up a bit is that talking about the negative influences. Yeah. Well, I talked about my father wasn't around much, and I don't think that was a good thing. But you know, the generation, he came out of the Depression, and a lot of the idea often was the father is the breadwinner, so he's not often there for the effective aspects of raising a child. I don't think that hurt me tremendously, but it was something lacking. Part of it was growing up in an LA suburb. You know, it's a very different world out there. I moved to Columbus recently, and they have all these metro parks and places you can get out to the country fairly quickly, but in LA it was very difficult to do. And I grew up in a place called Diamond Bar, which was kind of I guess it would be considered upper middle class suburb. Very simple houses, but the ticky-tacky houses, you know.
As far as the eye can see when you're flying in over them, right? Just as far as the eye can see.
Yeah, and we had a pool because my father had grown up around a lake, so he wanted to swim, and I learned to swim. So, but there was always something lacking, and I think there was what I might call something bourgeois about it. Namely, the highest ideals were material ideals. Everybody in our block, we knew a lot of people in our block, and they all had religion. Everybody had some religion. We had the Catholics across the street, and we had the Mormons, and we had the guy next door that was an English professor who was an agnostic, and I liked him best, actually, of all the neighbors. But everybody had some kind of religion. But it's like the whole atmosphere was we reach a certain plateau, and then we're comfortable. And that's what we're searching for, is comfort. And even religion becomes a means of furthering comfort, right? It becomes, God becomes like the eternal vending machine for our pleasure. So, and I think this is something endemic to Protestantism because of at least this is a tendency it has, because of the doctrine of grace through faith alone. You don't have to strive. If you're forgiven, you might, out of the generosity of your heart, want to be good, but you don't have to strive for that because you don't achieve an end. You've reached your end. Yeah. So God becomes, what does God become? You pray to God for what? Not for virtue, not for holiness. You pray to God for material goods. And I think so that was the kind of neighborhood it was. And you know, the architecture was boring. I mean, we had hills around which were pretty. But everything was just, it wasn't like the kids growing up in the country having to be able to go to see streams and experience nature. It was a housing development. And so what I tended to do as a young child is I withdrew into my imagination. Partly because of movies I'd seen, partly because of books I'd read, I would imagine things. And so much so that the people in the neighborhood would say to me, "What are you today, Christopher?" Because I would dress up in these different costumes. I saw the movie The Ten Commandments, and so I put on this Mexican poncho and I got this stick, and I would pretend I was Moses. I'd part the pool, right? That was that sort of thing. And that was a way I think what I was looking for was something that would move me beyond that kind of a middle class dreariness that we had where I was growing up, and so that was something that fueled me. And I think it was one of the things that attracted me to the Jesus movement people, was because here was something that was going beyond. It was something that was saying, there's no limit, right? There's no limit to devotion to God. We should cast everything aside for this purpose, right? It was almost the spirit of St. Francis stripping himself in front of the bishop, right? That was the sense I got. No compromise, what was that? Keith Green. Remember Keith Green? When I was a teenager, I really liked to listen to Keith Green for a while. And his whole message of no compromise, that moved me. So that's what I was looking for. And I didn't find a Lutheran church, but I must say that began my interest in things religious. I remember, maybe about 10 years old, 10 or 11, I decided I wanted to read the Bible. So I got my father's big King James version and started opening it. I remember my father walking into the bedroom one day and see me reading the Bible, and I think he was first shocked. And then he was extremely pleased. "So you're reading the Bible?" And I said, "Yes." And so he ended up giving me a living Bible. I think I've been better off with King James, but he was, he was really happy to see that. And so I began reading the Bible, and I began looking for this genuineness, which I couldn't find in the Lutheran Church. So I was, my brother didn't stay long at Concordia. He came back to California at a certain point, and he ended up going to the Melodyland School of Theology. I was
going to say, I'm not sure the charismatic would have worked very well at Concordia at the time.
Well. Yeah. But so he came back to California. So he continued to be an influence on me in that way, towards that kind of evangelicalism. I remember when I was in 5th and 6th grade, that was affecting me. And particularly in 6th grade, one of the things I got really interested in, because I guess it was adventurous, it was almost like a fantasy, was the late great planet Earth. Yeah. All that stuff about the tribulation and the rapture and all those things. And I lapped that stuff up because it seemed so heroic. And you remember the disputes over is the rapture going to occur before the tribulation, the middle of the tribulation, the end of the tribulation? I wanted it to occur at the end of the tribulation because it was much more heroic. That was my sense. I thought pre-tribulation rapture, that's just for the weak.
For wimps.
Yeah. I want to be a martyr, right? So when I was in 6th grade, I was causing some trouble because I was telling the kids about all this stuff in the Lutheran school. And so
that wasn't exactly Lutheran theology.
No, not in the least. No, not in the least. So, right. And a good friend of mine, he went and told on me that I was telling these things to the kids. And our teacher was this older woman. It was very, very strict. So she was quite upset. So she had me go to the principal. And I remember it was 6th grade. I told you I was a weird kid. I'm in the principal's office. Why? Because I'm talking about millennialism to the students. And I remember just arguing with the principal over millennialism and, basically saying, I think it's in the scriptures. And I would think a Lutheran wouldn't have any problem with that. I mean, it's private interpretation and all, but they did. I wasn't really punished for it. I think I was just told to...
keep it cool.
Keep it cool, yeah. I probably should have said, here I stand, right? But but that was the sort of things that was influencing me. We moved from Diamond Bar to a town called Upland in San Bernardino County. It's not too far from LA, but it's just the county line over. When I was in 7th grade, and I went to another Lutheran school, and so one of my other influences there was. More in my 8th grade year was a man, was the assistant pastor at the church. He was an interesting fellow. There was a big split in the Missouri Synod back, I think, in the early 70s. I don't want to say the exact date, called the Seminary in Exile.
Right.
Because the Missouri Synod was upset in part because these professors were teaching that you don't have to believe in a literal seven-day creation. I'm sure there were other things that were a bit more problematic for everybody that they were teaching as well. And so those professors broke off and founded this other seminary called the Seminary in Exile. Well, this assistant pastor had been with Seminex for a while, and then he came back to the Missouri Synod. So he was a very intelligent man. I remember when I first met him, he was studying Syriac. He knew, I think, Greek and Hebrew. He went to the St. Louis Seminary in the end, and he studied German and Greek and Hebrew, and he knew Latin. So he was interested. He was a younger man. He was just freshly ordained in the Lutheran Church, and he befriended me. I can't exactly know why, but he befriended me, and we began to talk an awful lot. And he would take me we'd go on hikes with some other young people. He was the head of the youth group, and he began to influence me into a more intellectual direction, I would think, in part. And plus, he just kind of introduced me to something different. It didn't germinate for a while, but liturgy and a kind of more high church way of looking at things.
Which I think was one of the split issues.
You're right. Mm-hmm.
One group was getting a little bit too Catholic sounding here, right. And that's what would cause the split back then. So he might have been influenced by that very thing. I found out later he was never a hard nose about the liturgy. He was much more accepting of anything that leads you to the Word, right? But he himself, his tastes went in that direction. I remember later on he got a chasuble, which was not, the chasubles were not worn in the Lutheran Church in those days. So that was another influence. So he became another mentor to me as well for the course of my conversion. But I was decidedly in an evangelical mode, and I denied sacraments. I thought the Lutheran worship was too staid and too rigid. The whole Jesus movement thing. If you're going to praise God, you should praise God from your heart, right? Not from written words. Right. That's God doesn't want to hear the same thing every day.
That's right. I remember
feeling the same thing, right?
So that was, I was all that sort of thing influenced me. So much so that I think it was my seventh or eighth grade year, I was to be confirmed in the Lutheran Church. And part of the Missouri Synod, you swear eternal fidelity to the Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod, right? Because the Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod thinks that, they're the only ones who have the real. Maybe there's a couple like the Wisconsin Synod, but they're the ones who have the true teaching of Christ. And so you want to confess, the Missouri Synod confesses, obviously. So I was to be confirmed. And
you wouldn't fellowship with the Lutheran Church of America or the American,
no communion, no mutual communion.
Yeah.
I think the Wisconsin Synod was the only one.
Right.
So, I was to be confirmed, and I said to my parents, "I'm not going to be confirmed." I said, because I cannot say I accept the teachings of the Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod. Well, my father was not terribly happy about this, and he was actually advised by friends of his, just make him do it. Make him do it. And I guess deep down inside, I kind of wish they were going to make me do it so I could say no.
Here I stand.
That's right. Yeah. So, so my father was wise, though. And I think because he realized I was maybe a lot like him. He knew, I think, that if he did that, I would just rebel. And he would just turn me into a martyr to be the very thing I wanted to be. No compromise, right? That was the spirit. So he didn't make me. He said, you decide for yourself. And he told me he wasn't happy with it, but he was going to let me do it. He probably lost some dignity amongst his fellow Lutherans for doing that. But I think back and I think he was wise. He knew better in that way. So I continued to go to the Lutheran Church because my parents went there. I couldn't drive until about my 10th grade year. And my 10th grade year, we moved to Upland, and they moved to another place in Upland, and it was in walking distance of an Assemblies of God church. And I said, I'm going to go to the Assemblies of God church because I was thinking to myself, I'm going to find those Jesus freaks there. I'm going to find the Jesus movement people, the people whose faith just influences everything in their lives, who are not bought and sold by consumerism and middle class culture, and they're not going to separate the religion out. They're going to it's going to be a unit, right? Their whole life is going to be influenced by this. I thought I was going to find it there. I didn't. Things had changed quite a bit since what was it, 1970, 73, 75, I think it was. So it must have been several years, 5 or 6 years later. Things had changed, and they weren't the same anymore. Remember, Keith Green used to talk about this, right? He would say, you talk about you go in the Christian bookstores and you see the piggy bank that says Jesus saves on it. Things like that. And it just struck me. I thought, it's not here. This is not what I was looking for. And so that led me on a further search. But before I get on that further search, I should probably talk about my third and probably the most important mentor, my fourth, I should say, the most important mentor that I had in my growing up years. I went, when I entered high school, I went to a place called Lutheran High School in Laverne, California. And I guess I had some intellectual, I was always interested in intellectual things. I read, 19th century novels, and I read books on Bible history or, sometimes Lutheran, Protestant theology. The thing I didn't like was philosophy, because I was told philosophy is just bad, right?
Yeah.
It's just a bad thing. So I kind of scoffed at things like philosophy. So I went to Lutheran High School. I remember I was signing up for classes and they offered Latin. And I said, I'm going to take Latin. I thought it'd just be really interesting to take Latin. So I took Latin beginning my freshman year in high school. My sophomore year in high school, I had a new teacher came in. And he was a student at the Claremont Graduate School in political science. And I found out he went to this rather strange college. I didn't find this out till later, but he went to a rather strange college called Thomas Aquinas College in Santa Paula. And his name was Kevin Long. And he became my Latin teacher. And after a while, he and I began to have conversations. And they would always turn on some kind of intellectual thing. And he would ask me questions and then hear my response, and he would ask me other questions to kind of elucidate my opinions, that maybe to lead me in the direction to show, maybe you're not quite right about this, right? That's what he would say. But he was very cagey, because when I'd ask him, I said, well, what denomination do you belong to? He'd say, I'm a mere Christian. And for about 2 years, he would not own up to being Catholic. He would just say, I'm a mere Christian. And he told me later, he said he did that because he didn't want to be completely just shut off right from the beginning. Because if I heard Catholic, I'd say, that's it. And which was true.
Yeah.
Which is true.
Hey, Christopher, let's pause there.
Okay.
It's time for a little break. It is interesting that sometimes in evangelization you have to recognize that, at least in this country, some people have a down deep anti-Catholicism that's there that it'll shut it right off if you go there. So your mentor was being gentle with that, so he could continue the dialogue. We'll pick on that when we come back. Pick up on that when we come back in a moment. Christopher Zehnder is our guest. We'll come back to his story in just a moment. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our guest is Christopher Zehnder, and I've interrupted you. You were talking about philosophy, right?
Right, yeah. The whole notion that somehow philosophy is a dangerous thing, and obviously it can be a very dangerous thing. I remember one thing Kevin Long said to me was, I remember bringing up the whole thing about philosophy because Paul says, do not be led astray by vain philosophy. I remember Kevin just said, well, if there's vain philosophy, there must be philosophy that's not vain. And I thought, yeah, I guess that might follow. And so perhaps there is a philosophy which is, one can actually embrace. And it's a weird thing to think. I mean, why is philosophy vain and history is not vain? Why is philosophy vain and natural science isn't vain? Why is philosophy vain and, I don't know, any discipline is not? But there's this sense, at least not so much for the Lutherans, I don't think it's true of the Lutherans, but it's true of many evangelicals, that philosophy is a very dangerous thing.
Right.
And that, like I said, that influenced me. But when Kevin said that, I still remember that day. I remember thinking, I felt kind of liberated because he was interesting me. I was getting interested in all this discussion we were having, and I felt kind of a guilty pleasure in it. Like the time what I felt when I first read The Lord of the Rings when I was evangelical, I was worried because there were magicians and there was magic in there. I thought, is this something demonic? But I took a great pleasure. But the guilty pleasures, I began to feel this. I first felt this guilty pleasure about philosophy, but after he said that, I began to think, well, maybe it's not so bad after all. And so that was my sophomore year in high school. He was my Latin teacher, and we would, after class, we would discuss things. And I remember once going to this. It made a real impression on me. We went to a wedding. Some friends of ours were being married in Our Lady of the Assumption Church in Claremont, California. And I think it was probably my first time at a Catholic Mass. And I don't really remember much about the Mass. I don't think it was probably a very high Mass, and the music wasn't Gregorian chant or anything of the sort. But I remember sitting in the church, and behind the altar was what do you call it, a drapery with Our Lady on it, Our Lady of Guadalupe, and looking at the stained glass windows, and all of a sudden it just hit into my mind this thought, what if it's all true? And it's like, why would I be thinking that? I mean, I didn't know Kevin was a Catholic, and as far as I knew, Catholics were all just ignorant people that believed weird superstitions. But it really hit me, and it wasn't just a passing thought. It was something that just influenced me right down to the core of my being. And I thought, no. I said, they don't read the Bible. How could they be the true church? So I just dismissed it, but it stuck with me. I remember afterwards talking to Kevin about that whole experience. So I know it was something that really influenced me. And we were talking, I think we were talking about the devotion of the Virgin Mary and the various things in a kind of detached, mere Christian sort of way. Not to let on where he was. I did try to catch him once. He came to school once with the smudge on the side. I said, you're Catholic. He says, I could be Swedish Lutheran. So he wouldn't admit to that. But so I was having that influence, but still, like, my brother was an influence on me. Like I said, I was going to the Assemblies of God Church. At one point, my brother I don't know if it's that year, I can't remember exactly the years, but he became a minister in a place called Mount Baldy, California, which is a mountain community in the San Antonio Canyon, right above where we lived. A little called Mount Baldy Community Church, and I would go up there, and I was really moved by going up there, and part of my brother was the pastor. But the people I met, they were not only serious Christians, but they were people who were some of them just interesting people. Kind of, there was one fellow, kind of he had sort of the hippie habits. He did organic gardening and that sort of thing, long hair. And he and I most of my friends have always been older than I was, so we would talk about all sorts of organic gardening. We talk about he was an environmentalist. And we talk about the environment and all these different things. And it was I really enjoyed going up there, and it was through that influence that my brother actually I don't know if he was the one who convinced me to do this, but I thought I should do it, as I thought I should be baptized. I was baptized as an infant in the Lutheran Church, but I didn't believe in that sort of thing anymore. I thought baptism was something that followed faith. So I was baptized at Huntington Beach by my brother in the ocean. I was baptized a second time. I guess it was objectively a sacrilege, but I didn't know. But so that was other things. So I have these contradictory things going on. The third thing, which is more on the level of nature, I would say, is this. My brother, as I said, went to Melodyland School of Theology. I don't know if a lot of people probably have never heard of it. It was a school of theology. What was it? I can't remember the name of the founder, but he was prominent. He was the first Bible answer man.
Oh, yeah.
He was at least one of the founders. But it was an evangelical seminary, basically, and it was centered at this place called Melodyland, which was a theater in the round, literally a theater around with a stage in the middle, and it was across, basically very near to Disneyland. And it had been a theater in the round. I remember the story was, and I can't vouch for this, that for some reason they kept the name Melodyland because they were not allowed to change it for some reason. So they called it Melodyland School of Theology, which I always thought was kind of odd. Right. But I would go there. My brother was going there, and I remember visiting there. It was probably a bit earlier than when I was 15, but no, it must be when I was about 15. But anyway, I remember going there, and they had this dramatic presentation. My brother was going to be in it. It was something called like Instruments of the Spirit, or something probably more pithy than that. But it was all these different events in the history of salvation where the Holy Spirit has led the church into new heights. So it starts back in the ancient times. And it goes through, it has Martin Luther, of course. And my brother didn't play Martin Luther. He played one of the monks. And, you know, the myth of the Scala Santa in Rome, where Luther was climbing this and on his knees, and he suddenly realizes that the just shall live by faith, and he stands up and proclaims his doctrine from the Scala Santa, which, you know, there's no proof of that ever happened. It's doubtful it ever happened. My brother was one of the monks who were appalled at this. All that didn't move me so much. What moved me was they had a presentation on Handel writing Messiah, and it did not so much the story of writing Messiah moved me, was the music they were playing. There was somebody up there on a harpsichord playing Handel. Now my father, who, to back up a little, he had been an opera singer when he was young, and he had a very large classical music collection that nobody listened to. And I didn't listen to it because, you know, I'd gotten, when I was earlier on, I liked John Denver, and then I got into country western, and I got into Christian rock music, all that sort of thing. So I never listened to any of that stuff. It was boring, like the Lutheran service, just boring. So I heard it, I thought, this is pretty good. This is pretty good stuff. So I went home and I got my father's LPs of Messiah. I listened to that. Then I began to listen to all the other ones. And then I just threw everything aside. I got rid of rock, and I didn't want to listen to rock and roll anymore, country western, nothing. I only wanted to listen to classical music. I became a real snob. But I think it was important, because what it was directing my tastes to higher things, to better things. Yeah. So it was moldy. It's I think how God works through the natural order. Sometimes He you know, that you can become just a mere snob by liking classical music, and classical people in classical music field are not necessarily the most moral of people themselves, but it can be an introduction to beauty. Is an introduction. Through beauty, we long for something higher. It's an icon, right? The music, architecture, painting, they're all icons of God ultimately. And if properly guided, that love of beauty can lead you to higher things. And I was being properly guided in many ways by, well, Kevin Long was one of the big influences, and he of course was also a classical music snob. So and Paul, the assistant minister, I don't want to mention his name, but he was also he had built his own clavichord. He played classical music. And so I began to be drawn into this sort of thing, and so I think this was influencing me away from evangelicalism, because I'd go to the Assembly of God, and it would just be you have the organ, the piano, and the guitars, and sometimes we'd just have concerts, and I thought this was grating on me. It was really grating on me. So I began to think, this can't be the genuine Church of Christ. This didn't seem genuine. I didn't find the Jesus freaks there. I found kind of a more upbeat Lutheranism. So my love of history began to influence me, and I began to think, well, maybe I need to look at something older, some older style of church. I wasn't ready to think about the Lutherans yet, because they were just wrong about sacraments. There was, nearby where I lived, there was a church called the Brethren in Christ, and they were descended from the Anabaptists. But when I started going there, the women still wore Amish-style head coverings. And so I saw this church, and I thought, well, they have a more traditional kind of worship, and it's an older church. Maybe I'll start going there. So I started going there as well, thinking maybe I'll find what I'm looking for there. And after a while, I remember going to meet with the minister, because I wanted to find out. I wanted to see what they believed before so he gave me a little booklet of the confessions of their church. So I remember sitting down with him and discussing this, say, well, yeah, I can see that. There's some things here I don't quite agree with. And I guess he was sort of freaked out by it too, because he thought, who's this 15-year-old kid coming talking about doctrine and telling me what I should think? But I started going there for a while, but after a while I didn't find it there as well. And that led me ultimately, when I could drive, I began to go up to Mount Baldy Community Church, where my brother was. And I thought I found it there for a while, because there was a kind of genuine fellowship. It was a small church, family-like. And so in terms of that, I began to see that there was something really genuine there. But at the same time, like I said, I have Kevin Long. So it comes to my end of my sophomore year. And they didn't offer third year Latin in my high school, but I wanted to take third year Latin. And so Kevin said he would come in on his free time and teach me Latin. I had a period off, and so I forget how many days a week it was, but he would come in and do Latin with me. Well, what he began to do was pretty cagey as well. He thought I might want to translate some medieval Latin. So he brought in the first question of the Summa Theologica, and we translated it from the Latin. And our Latin classes became more than just Latin classes. They became philosophy and theology classes. We began to discuss all sorts of things about, with this mere Christian, about all tending towards the Catholic faith. So I about the same time, I don't know who introduced this book to me. It might have been the assistant pastor. I don't think it was Kevin. But I began reading the St. Augustine's Confessions.
Oh, yeah.
And I was reading this, and I was reading about the church he was talking about, and I said, I want this church. Where is this church? It's obviously, it's not the Assemblies of God, it's not the Brethren in Christ, it's not my brother's church, you know, for how commendable everybody was there. Part of it was, you know, liturgical. I was beginning to develop a desire for liturgy, and it wasn't at Mount Baldy Church. I was developing a desire for order, and the kind of order that I saw in history, the historical church, because I'd also read Eusebius's History of the Church when I was a teenager. I began to long for as well, and so I began to think, maybe the Lutheran Church isn't so bad after all. In other words, what I was looking for, and I didn't know it, was the Catholic Church. The church that St. Augustine was talking about was the Catholic Church, and I didn't know it. The closest thing I could come to at the time was the Lutheran Church. So I went to the assistant pastor, and I began talking about, you know, can I be confirmed in the Lutheran Church? And of course, he was quite happy by the whole business.
Right.
And I can't remember if I took any instruction. I don't remember all the details of that. But ultimately, I became a Lutheran again. Kevin used to say, jokingly, he'd say, I converted him to Lutheranism, and the Lutherans converted him to Catholicism, which in some ways is true. But so I entered the Lutheran Church, and probably at the end of my junior year in high school, I was received back in the Lutheran Church, and then I entered my senior year, the decision, what am I going to do for my future? I was tending to think, maybe I want to be a Lutheran minister. Maybe I'll become a minister. And I was thinking, first, I'd like to be ordained in the Lutheran Church and go teach in university. But the assistant pastor gave me this book. I remember it was a book written by a Swedish Lutheran. It was about a Swedish Lutheran pastor, and his trials with the congregation. And the assistant pastor gave this to me to influence me towards congregational work, because he thought that was very important. And he told me, he says, well, it's fascinating being in a congregation, because you get all the first 3 century heresies in a particular Lutheran congregation. Right. So I was thinking about that. Kevin, I finally figured out what he was. And he would, after I took German my senior year, but he would invite me over to his house. He and his wife would have me over, Kevin and Martha Long, and they would have me over to their house for dinner. Martha was always a very good cook. And then Kevin and I would go out he had a study, and we'd go and discuss things. And I remember one time in particular, this was sometime my senior year, we got into an argument about purgatory. And I was going to prove to him that purgatory was contrary to Scripture. Well, he presented me such arguments that showed me that purgatory wasn't contrary to Scripture. In fact, does it make any sense that a soul that has sin, stained with sin, would go into the next life in the presence of God stained with sin? There has to be some purification. And I thought, yeah, there has to be some purification. And so I began to be a Lutheran who believed in purgatory. And I asked the assistant pastor about it. We went out to breakfast one morning, and I said, is there any way a Lutheran can hold to purgatory? He says, well, I think you probably could, as long as it had nothing of works righteousness in it. So we had, that was the kind of, Kevin was influencing more and more to the Catholic faith. The art of the Catholic world, the history of the Catholic world were also influencing me as well at that point. So what finally happened is that Kevin convinced me I should go visit Thomas Aquinas College. He thought I'd be a good student there. So I went with my father there, which was a very strange experience. My father, I left my...
He knew where he was going, right? To a Catholic. He knew he was going
Oh,
to
yeah,
visit
he
your
knew
dad.
that.
Your dad
He knew
did.
that.
You did, yeah.
He knew that. And he... But I remember we were in one of the dormitories. We used to have devotion to the Sacred Heart. And the guy who was my unofficial guide was an Anglican there. He was an Anglican student. So he said, I said, what's going on here? He said, oh, it's just some Romish nonsense. Let's go up this way. My poor father, though, I abandoned there in the middle of all these Catholics praying the Sacred Heart devotion. And we went to Mass there. They had the Latin, they had the New Rite and the Latin. And I remember thinking, this is not a whole lot different than Lutheran service. What's the big deal? But so I was intrigued by the place. I met the students, and I thought, this is the kind of place I want to go. But I had this deep-seated fear that if I went to a Catholic school, I'd be forced to become a Catholic. They would just drag me in. So I ended up not going there. I went to Christ College, which is now part of Concordia University in Irvine, California, to enter the pre-seminary program. Well, that was when everything came to a head, because I was thinking about a number of different things. I get in discussions with my brother, who I'd come, of course, to believe in sacraments, being a Lutheran. My brother didn't believe in sacraments, so we'd get in discussions. Our family was we had a lot of vibrant theological fights in our family, which kept us together, kept us close. It's a German thing, right? We'd get these, and I remember what I call the most significant period of my life was this one Christmas. It was the Christmas of 1982. And my brother and I had this disagreement over infant baptism. And I went to bed that night. Well, I lay in bed till I remember it was like 2 a.m, worried that I was wrong. And I thought, how do I know that he's wrong and I'm right? And St. Paul says, if even an angel from heaven should preach to you another gospel, let him be accursed. I didn't want to be accursed. And so I was filled with this fear that I'd be accursed. Well, the next morning I woke up, and I just happened to have it with me, this photocopy thing called Lutherans and Catholics in Dialogue that Kevin Long had given me. And I began reading it. And I read the Catholic position, and I thought, this makes a whole lot of sense. A church authority, that there's an interpreter, the church is an interpreter of what's in Scripture. And I remember saying to my mother, after reading, I said, Mother, I'm afraid I'm going to become a Catholic. So I went back to the school, thinking very seriously I was going to become a Catholic, and I became kind of a notoriety because of Zehnder thinking of becoming a Catholic was something, given the history of the family and everything.
An oxymoron.
Yeah, and I remember I had a philosophy professor at the time, and I thought I want somebody to prove me wrong, so I thought I'd go to him and he would prove me wrong. And he would take me out to lunch. We'd have these sessions together. We'd discuss. He'd give me things to read, and then we'd get together and we'd talk about it. And at the end of our session, he ended the session just on his own initiative. He said, I see which direction you're going. He said, let me tell you something, a story. He says, when I was, several years ago, we were in Rome, my wife and I was in St. Peter's, and I knelt down before the high altar, and he said, I could hear all the angels and saints calling me to become Catholic. And I felt really moved to do so. He said, but then I remembered I was a Lutheran minister, that I had a family, children, and I couldn't do it. And he just looked at me, and he said nothing more. That was the sessions were ended. The next fellow I wrote for an English paper, I wrote on apostolic succession. And so this one professor comes to my room and he says, so I hear you're interested in apostolic succession. I said, well, yes. He says, why don't we have some sessions on that, and we can discuss it and you get a credit. I said, okay, it's fine. So we had these sessions. They were rancorous. He would give me this thing. It was supposedly a list of patristic quotations that proved sola scriptura. So I went to the library, I had a good library, and I looked through, the church fathers, and I found a bunch of other quotations about the church. And I said, well, as I see it, these scripture's authority, but always in light of the church's being authority, being within the church. And he said, I remember him saying, well, it's really not so important what the fathers say now, is it? Let's read the book of Galatians. So we read the book of Galatians, and we had the same thing. I came up with an interpretation. And I remember at the end of the thing, he said to me, well, I can see what path you're taking. Intellectually, it makes sense, but spiritually, I don't know. And I thought, it's a good intellectual path, but not a good spiritual path. How does this make any sense? So, and I said to him, kind of put a parting jab. I remember standing in the doorway and looking. I said, "Thank you, Professor So-and-so." I said, "And I'll pray a decade for you." And he gave me this look like he wanted to kill me. But the final fellow was my father asked this guy to talk to him. He talked to me, and he was a friend of my father, and his whole appeal was, well, you probably become a priest. You become Catholic. I don't know if I'm going to be a priest. You'll become a priest. Look at the benefits you'll have being a Lutheran minister as opposed to being a Catholic priest. You can get married. You can choose what congregation you serve in. I was 18 years old. You know what I'm saying? I don't care about this truth. I care about, don't you see? But it was like he was giving me all these practical arguments for it. And I thought at that point, if that's all they can do, that's it. And so what I did is I was admitted to Thomas Aquinas College next year, and that's where I became Catholic. I was received in December of 1983. But it was a very hard time for me because I was filled with terror, really, that I was doing the wrong thing. I was one of those difficult times, I think, in my life. I used to take long walks, and I would try to think of arguments against my positions, and I would think of counter arguments. It was it was a very intense period. So, but when I went to TAC, it was a different world, and I was also received in the church there. Kind of the party thing with my father, I always think is the funniest story, is that he picked me up after I was received in the church. Because I had told him about a year before that I was going to think about Catholic. And he picks me up and he says, "Son, I'm disappointed in you." I said, "Why?" He said, "You told me to wait a year before you became a Catholic." I said, "Yeah, Dad, that was a year ago." "Well," he said, "it's bad enough you became Catholic. He says, but if you become a priest, your grandmother will turn over in her grave." It's funny though, because after that he would help me find parish to go to in the area, and it's like even after I was married, my wife and I met at TAC. We got married in '87. Even after we were married, he would tell Catholic jokes and things like that. Well, that's not after we were married, but right before. Then he went to our wedding, and he saw me praying with my friend of mine, and he said to me I remember it was my father's 65th birthday party, and he said, "I want you to know," he says, "I saw you praying with your best man before the wedding." I said, "I realize your religion is genuine." He says, "I'll never insult it again." He did tell a few some Catholic jokes, but that was so yeah, into the Catholic Church. And
the verse that you mentioned about the fear of being pulled away by a false gospel. The interesting thing about that from your background is with all these different directions, again, how do you know which one? So that you're drawn back to, where's a trustworthy source? The church that our Lord established.
It has to be the church, because this is Jesus became man. He was incarnate. Why? Because we're human beings and we need something physical. The body is important. I think at the root of a lot of Lutheranism, initially with Luther, is a kind of Gnosticism, Manichaeanism, the almost sense that the flesh is evil. And you find that, I think, in a lot of Protestantism. One of the revelations to me when I became a Catholic was they kissed bones. And I thought this was wonderful. I remember telling my mother, I said, "They kissed bones." And I think she thought, this is really strange. Why is he getting excited over this? Well, it was physicality. It was the physical world can be redeemed. Yeah. And the church, we need the church because we're human beings. If there's no church, that's what I began to say, if there's no church, if the Catholic Church is wrong, I thought, I'm just going to leave Christianity behind. I can have a lot more fun other places, and I don't want anything to do with it because it makes no sense.
Yeah, even your friend, his mere Christianity, if there is no trustworthy church, then that mere Christianity whittles down to nothing.
Right.
Which one do you hold on to?
Right. Well, that's what Lewis suffers right in his book. He has the mansion with the several different rooms. Well, it doesn't work because they're saying contrary things. Yeah. And who do you know has the truth? You either have to say, I think a lot of Protestants have come to this point, the truth is not important, except in a very few doctrines. It doesn't matter whether you believe in infant baptism or not. It doesn't matter what you believe about the virgin birth. What it matters is these essentials. But who determines that? Who decides that? Yeah. And if without the church, without that, St. Paul calls the church the fullness of Christ. And that's because Christ is, in a sense, incomplete without the church. Not because he's incomplete in himself, but because in order to incarnate the whole of creation, he needs this body. And he needs it because he created it to be that.
And he tells us apart from him, we can do nothing.
Right.
Well, how do we get connected with him? Through his church, through the sacraments and through that. Christopher, let's say the audience wants to connect with your writings. You have a website or a blog?
We do the Catholic Textbook Project, catholictextbookproject.com. And if I may mention it, be shameless, I'm writing a series of novels on the Reformation. The first one is called A Song for Elsa, E-L-S-E. And it can be found on Amazon, obviously, with my name, Christopher John Zehnder. And I'm soon to be publishing the second part of it, which actually goes through what we call the heroic years of the Reformation from 1515 to 1525.
All right, my friend. Well, thank you for telling us your story, Christopher. That was awesome. Too bad we ran out of time. I'd like to ask a few more questions from him. But, well, no doubt to apologize. Thank you for the journey. And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I do pray that Christopher's journey is an encouragement to you. God bless you, my friend. See you next week.